Tēnā tātou. Thank you, David, for that introduction. And yeah, again, thank you to everyone who spoke this morning and for the stimulating and challenging kōrero that we've already heard. So as David starts off there, this panel is exploring this question of how or what is the role of museums in reassessing the New Zealand wars. And part of the context of my contribution to this panel is that myself and Nigel Burrell have been part of a team who are looking at how the New Zealand wars can be represented to audiences today in 2023 and beyond, looking at the renewal of our own galleries here at Auckland War Memorial Museum. So, and my contribution in that will be actually to look at how Auckland Museum reassessed the New Zealand wars, or attempted to reassess the New Zealand wars in the past. And it reflects this place, as we've heard already this morning, this of the War Memorial and the kind of cultural scripts of remembrance that a site and institution such as a War Memorial Museum encompasses and inscribes and sustains. And it also reflects the fact that this museum holds the largest collection of taonga and objects relating to these conflicts. And then I'll hand over to Nigel to talk a bit about how we're rethinking the wars today. So this is the entrance of the New Zealand Wars Gallery today, more or less as it opened in 1996. It was part of a wider refurbishment of the second floor galleries of the War Memorial Museum, developed in two sort of stages. So the first, what we now think of as Scars on the Heart, New Zealanders at War. So the first stage, or the first wing of that redevelopment was this section, which encompassed the New Zealand Wars, the Boer War and the First World War, which opened in 1996, and then the second sort of wing and the second stage of that was opened in 1999, which really encompassed the Second World War and the Pacific and European theatres of that conflict. And a third kind of shift that's happened since has been the renovation of these two corners of the second floor relating to the First World War, Pokanahi, exploring the experience of the First World War, which opened in time for the centenary or around the time of the centenary, and then Po Maumahara, which is a discovery centre, so a sort of learning space, which was also about relating to histories of service and commemoration of war. So obviously this places the development of the New Zealand Wars Gallery, which opened in January 1996, in the midst of this 1990s period, which reflects some big shifts that are happening in commemoration and remembrance of war. So we could think about the 50th anniversary of the end of the Second World War. So partly what funds this renovation is government funding for that commemoration, a sort of belated funding that's made available as part of a sort of a wider plan of renovation by the museum. It reflects that what has been called the Anzac Revival, so the new sort of interest in Gallipoli and stories of Gallipoli as kind of nation-building stories. It reflects also that importance shift, but also, of course, and it sort of rides in some ways on the coattails of those shifts that are happening. It also reflects a different set of changes happening around the revisiting of colonial histories, some of which we've already touched on today. So the documentary series, New Zealand Wars, of course, the tribunal process, new commitments to biculturalism. We could think about some of the shifts that are happening in museums for Māori communities. Te Māori exhibition a decade earlier. These are influencing, both sort of coming into play here. And that was recognised in the team that's put together to work out this new New Zealand Wars Gallery, which is the first exhibition that directly presents New Zealand Wars objects in the museum, and it's the first national exhibition to do so in Aotearoa. And reflecting that, there were two sort of lead curators, so Nigel Prickett and with Buddy Mikaere brought on as as the Māori consultants on the project. It was meant to be a bilingual exhibition, or it was to be a bilingual exhibition, reflecting these new commitments to biculturalism. And given due respect, I think, in what was the initial kind of design plan of this significant renovation. So you can see this from the archives here at the museum, and hopefully you can kind of make some of that out there. But what you'll notice is what I'll draw your attention to is the new way that the New Zealand Wars was pitched as civil wars here in this wing of the museum. But it also found space in this kind of this significant section of that wing. It also entailed this space here, which you would recognise today if you've visited this gallery as where the Zero fighter is now found. So this kind of section here, and the Centennial Street, which had opened in 1966 or thereabouts, was to be sort of renovated as a garrison town. So a new sort of story focusing on the kind of military story of Auckland's that Vincent O'Malley touched on today. So, and the themes of civil wars was to be around resistance, disposition, campaigning, aftermath, intertribal impact of technology. So these were sort of the themes that they were hoping would be conveyed in these new stories. The civil wars would also be incorporated into the new colours or the renovation of the colours gallery. Precisely the idea being that some of those flags from regimental and also iwi flags from the wars would be placed alongside the regimental flags of 20th century conflict. So really, I think, pointing to how there was this idea that these stories would be incorporated into this wider kind of national story of New Zealand in conflict. And so I should have done this before, sorry. This is much better picture, which is the zoom in of that. So just keep an eye on this space and we'll see how it shifts over time. Because what quickly happened is that vision sort of founders on a series of contentions and issues around interpreting these conflicts for audiences in the 1990s. And the first of what those conflicts was precisely around the naming of these galleries. And of course, I've already pitched to you the ways that they were initially termed the Civil Wars Gallery. So not obviously quite significant to the discussion of this symposium. Civil wars, as had been proposed by Mikaere, was a term that he believed explains the contested legacy of the wars for contemporary New Zealand society. Nigel Prickett, and Laurie Barber, who's a historian who'd been brought on to help consult on the wider gallery development, objected to this, and they saw it as anachronistic and kind of political co-option of the gallery. And they instead argued for a slightly more neutral branding of New Zealand wars. And these particularly framed around a wide understanding that these were contentious conflicts that had given way to a more unified Māori and Pākehā participation in wars of the First and Second World Wars. Or what the planning documents called a journey out of imperialist, colonial and somewhat innocent state of mind of the 19th century. So you can sort of start to see competing kind of narrative positions that the New Zealand Wars were placed. A concession to this, to a Māori, Mikaere's understanding was to call the wars, was to give them also a Māori name of Ka Whawhai Tonu Mātou, which of course you'll recognise as the cry of defiance at Orako, which had been popularised by Ranganui Walker's book, History of that was current at the time. So this was one contention that I'm abbreviating here. The second was really around, and really what the naming debate spoke to, was this contested positioning of the wars in this wider gallery renewal, which was again reflected in the competing kind of motifs that were given to these galleries, which was a sort of second tension. So the First World War gallery team, led by historian Chris Pugsley, proposed Scars on the Heart as the sort of organising motif of the gallery, and that came from an important poetry anthology, Scars Upon My Heart, which related a broader kind of experience of First World War, which was not just about soldiers' experience, but really talked about the legacy of war for families, particularly women and children. And so it spoke to an important shift that had already happened in First World War history and historiography, which is recognising that war isn't just about men on battlefields. And of course it conveyed the sense that the legacies of war are not just physical wounds, that they do speak to longer generational scarring. This was also then tied to a different kind of spatial arrangement, or sort of a built, which would emphasize built environments. It would place objects in kind of reconstructed landscapes. And so you can see an example of that here is what became the Western Front installation. And you can see the kind of literal reenactment of the Western Front in this corner of that gallery, and you can sort of see it as it is today. The New Zealand Wars team sought a different motif, and they proposed actually having at the front of the entrance of the New Zealand Wars gallery a warning about what their own exhibition entailed. And that was initially drafted as this, as you can read here. Kia tūpato ko ene ngā wahi pakanga o mua, te mana o naene hoki. Take care while you are here, for you walk across the fields of our blood and a past which is still very much present. And there were variations of this. And this was a sort of, I suppose speaks to a very different way of imagining the implication of these histories, and would be accompanied by different spatial arrangements, a very different kind of approach to what was happening in the wider gallery development. And you can see variations of this playing out in the design work of the gallery. So here you can see what was something more abstract and something more contemplative than the reenactment of the First World War gallery. And what you're sort of seeing here in these scribbles and slightly more artful drawing was the idea that this a model pā of Ruapekapeka, which had been accessioned in 1989, would be the centrepiece of a kind of reflective series of po whenua, which would be arranged to draw visitors into this kind of contemplative space. And the variation here incorporates something like a surveyor's tripod, drawing in stories of confiscation and raupatu. Here in this version, the model pā is placed in a slightly different arrangement, but you can sort of see this approach, and all of which was indicative of these contested histories, of these different perspectives on these histories. Now, the reference to fields of blood was deemed controversial and seen as unnecessarily graphic and contentious, and was subsequently dropped from the wording of the introduction, suggesting an unwillingness to engage in what was a very different way of a kind of rhetorical, poetic framing device. And this rhetorical retreat was then followed by a kind of physical retreat, with the decision by the wider museum team to collapse the New Zealand Wars into a much smaller space. So rather than having, which was really about making room for that wider, expansive built environment of the First World War. So precisely because one required more space, and the contemplative sort of concept of the New Zealand Wars Gallery sort of came into play. So what was meant to be these three expansive, reasonably two sort of expansive spaces, and I should say, actually, I meant to describe before that this space would be more of a sort of interactive activity centre, where sort of you can see described here what they described hologram talking heads, meaning that they'd interview experts and they'd have different stories told through experts, and make much more of an emphasis on education and this kind of facility, gave way to a much smaller real estate. So here we have the gallery as it is today, and you can see how much was lost in that prioritisation of gallery space, with the Boer War eventually filling this space, and everything here from here on being filled with the First World War and the Zero fighter plane relating to the Second World War would then take this space, so that this wider, expansive vision is then truncated. And the sort of complaints by the New Zealand Wars team that this was insufficient for this most important section of the scars on the heart. So that immediately led to these issues that we have today with this gallery. So one was the ways that this shift in physical space and the spatial arrangement of these walls was collapsed into a much smaller space. The narrative, the overriding narrative was between a Māori side of the story and a Pākehā side of the story, and those were collapsed here into as it is today. The objects themselves were condensed and became, even though it's very object heavy as an exhibition, it's not very object centered, and it becomes a much more sort of cluttered experience than a contemplative one. And attempts to introduce more complicated stories like, for example, rangiaowhia, as we've heard today, are not really given the space necessary to understand precisely the complex perspectives on these events. So, for example, when you go to the gallery today, and you'll see a black and white photo of St. Paul's Church, which we saw in Liana's presentation, is the only sort of reference to rangiaowhia and what had meant to be a much more sort of expansive story. And also attempts to place the walls in a more global and local context are kind of collapsed again. So this is a timeline that was meant to sort of put the walls in a wider context, imperial context, but just comes across as slightly strange and jarring and disconnected from what was happening locally. So I suppose, what are some of the lessons here we could draw out? One is, I think you can summarize it as a story of a big, ambitious vision, which is poorly executed. So planning is important, but also giving space to design and development and thinking is really crucial for such a complex topic. Ultimately, the decision, I think, to create the New Zealand Wars Gallery alongside this First World War Gallery did not work in its favour and did not serve these histories well. And in one way, it became a contest of space and resources. But I think at a deeper cultural level, I think what we see is that those very well-established cultural scripts of the First World War and 20th century conflicts, remembrance, override this attempt to create new public understandings and reflections on these histories. And of course, they were marked by similar problems that we have today, a lack of general public knowledge about these conflicts versus the overwhelming kind of importance and sort of emotional and ritual scripts and rituals that New Zealanders have when dealing with First World War history, for example. It also reflects a lack of ultimately thinking about where these an object-centered exhibition development. So there was very little thought into how these objects would be received, and also the histories that they themselves had, having come from these colonial conflicts. So there's no sort of community engagement and discussion. So if there's a need for future exhibition making to draw on those languages of memory that Arini so powerfully presented, that are in communities, those need to be translated or at least indicated into the spatial arrangements of exhibition making. And ultimately, there is a tension that remains around the different spaces of the museum itself, in which and the need for critical discussion about those relationships between spaces as well as objects. And those challenges remain today. And as the gallery itself essentially remains more or less intact as it has since it opened in 1996, except for one significant amendment, and that was the accession and then the display of one of the petition boxes that had collected signatures for the Otarahanga school petition, which was accessioned and then displayed in 2018. And as Lucy McIntosh described at the unveiling of this taonga, it's an object that has to do a lot of heavy lifting in this gallery, responding as it does to those community stories of rangiaowhia, as we've heard today. And of course, the ongoing challenge of this sense of the shatter zone that Joanna Kidman described today, that shapes how these stories are remembered, very different to perhaps the scarred tissue of these First World War galleries, and much more perhaps akin to the fields of blood that Makaire and others sought to warn us about at the opening of this exhibition. And on that note, I'll hand it over to Nigel.